I made a quick trip to the grocery store yesterday to purchase something I don't think that I've ever bought before. Now, it's really not too exotic. It speaks more about, I guess, us as a family, that it's just something we've never used before at our house because of all the things that we do, cook and bake, we've never gotten into making our own bread. What I bought yesterday is an important ingredient in making most breads. And as it happens, it's also an ingredient to making the other thing that we consume on Sunday mornings, namely wine. Bread and wine on our table here again today. And what's the important ingredient that they have in common? One? Yeast? Yeast. I didn't even really realize that yeast is used to make wine too. This is what I went to the grocery store for yesterday, because I want us to think in terms of yeast today. Yeast is an agent of fermentation, which is a process of what? Transformation. Turning something into something else. Yeast together with flour and water combines to transform dough into bread that rises as it bakes. Yeast combined with sugars in the grape juice ferments into alcohol, transforming the juice into wine. Jesus compares the reign of God to yeast. And he also warns his disciples of the yeast of the teaching of their leader as corrupted by human reigns. The two are different. Two different kinds of transformation. Now, in today's gospel reading, we also have this thing about the flesh of the Son of Man, that we are to eat his flesh and drink his blood in order to gain the abundant life of God's reign. He gets downright gross about it, in fact. You can't see it always in English, but he actually changes the word he uses for eat. And the second one I've translated as feeds upon. It was used more to talk about animals feeding, eating. It's almost what? Cannibalistic. Right. What is he doing? Next week, we'll read that this language is so offensive that almost everyone there leaves. Here's what I think Jesus is doing. He's using the language of the Eucharist, the meal that he will later give to his disciples and all of his followers throughout the ages, to talk about his basic mission. Namely, nothing less than to transform our humanity. And he brings yeast wisdom to us for that transformation. that Son of Man thing. Jesus didn't call himself Messiah or Christ, though he gave permission for others to do so. He didn't call himself Son of God. That came later. He chose to call himself in the third person, which is kind of strange. He chose to call himself Son of Man, signaling to us that he comes to do what? To bring us nothing less than a new generation of being human. This is the key to why I talk a lot about Jesus not coming to start a new religion. I think we've gotten that horribly wrong. He doesn't come to start something called Christianity. No, he comes to offer us nothing less than a new, better way of being human. All religions, in fact, have become infected with the sinful ways of being human, the ways that continually divide us and prevent us from being one human family working together to care for creation. Religions became one of the central means of dividing us. All the wars that we fought in the name of our religions. And so they become more a part of the problem than the solution. And that's why I've been warning us of the yeast of many of our human leaders, whose yeast of transformation is more of that same variety of violence through the ages that divides us. Their so-called Christian nationalism, that oxymoron, I think, is more of the same old, same old. Just like the Jewish leaders of Jesus' time, whose teachings and leadership worked more on the side of division rather than unity, on the side of fighting rather than the side of absorbing the violence as Jesus did. The yeast of Jesus' wisdom becomes clear on Good Friday. Standing before his human judge, Pontius Pilate, Jesus says that if his way of reigning was of the yeast of this world, his followers would be fighting. Instead, his power, his yeast of transformation from God, would empower him to do the opposite, to lay down his own life for the sake of the world. That's the difference in a nutshell. One power seeks to unite from force, which always ends up dividing us in some way or another. It's the power of human empires. The other power from God seeks to unite us through a compassion that even extends to enemies, seeking to turn them into friends. It is the only power which will truly bring peace. Jesus calls himself the Son of Man according to a vision in Daniel chapter 7, where the empires rise up out of the sea in these terrible beastly forms, representing their weapons and violence. And they meet this unarmed Son of Man, who comes to bring the only rain that will truly lead to peace. It's the wisdom of that rain that must be the yeast which transforms us. Where we do what? We work together as family to care for the world. This is the kind of humanity which we need to embrace to face the many kinds of crises that face us right now. I know it looms large for our young generation, like our college students. So many things that they have been given to worry about. We need a new way of being human in which our various religions themselves are transformed into means of helping us to work together. The choice between the yeast of compassion from God, which transforms our humanity, and the yeast of movements like Christian nationalism, which is at the very heart of the kind of choices before us over the next 80 days or so. One yeast brings further division and violence, the same old, and the other yeast offers a true alternative for the next generation of being human. We find ways of working together to solve the many crises that face us. It can begin with simple things like a tiny little congregation offering help to college students for the very high cost of higher education. It comes through putting together a free shop for clothes. But you see how in a democracy, with the politics of coming together to solve our problems together, we might also invite our fellow citizens to do what? For more of us to help make the cost of education for our young people more sustainable for more and more kids. So there's one further kernel of wisdom to glean from this morning's readings, especially the gospel. The difference between the ways of being human is represented in this meal that we share every Sunday, where we share these elements both transformed by wheat, the bread and the wine. What is the main ritual which that replaced? You know? Blood sacrifice. Blood sacrifice. Including things like cannibalism. The central ritual of untransformed religion, the religions which may divide us, is to kill an animal or a human being on an altar sacrifice. This is even true of the Christianity behind Christian nationalism, since its teaching about the meaning of the cross sees it in terms of sacrifice. I think that many of us grew up with that too, and it's something that's so important for us to finally leave behind. This teaching that thinks about the cross in terms of God demanding what? A sacrifice to pay for the cost of our sins. And Jesus steps in to pay the price. Sound familiar? But you see how that's the same blood sacrifice. That Jesus comes to transform and to give us something very different. Jesus instead gave us this meal around a table where we remember not him being sacrificed as payment for our sins to a wrathful God, but instead what? We remember a God of love, John 3:16, who sends his Son into the world to save it. To save us from killing ourselves in ritual things that we even represent religiously by killing things on altars. Jesus changes that, including the main representation of what we're supposed to be about as these new human beings. Not based on spilling someone else's blood, but in offering our own lives in service to one another and to God's creation. God isn't a wrathful God demanding sacrifice. We need to wake up to the anthropological fact that we are the ones who demand sacrifice. The divisive, violent ways of empire don't represent the true God. Rather, they represent us. That's our way of doing things. The cross itself represents one of those rituals of sacrifice. We execute our enemies. We go to war against them. The old rituals of blood sacrifice perfectly represent our human way of reigning, even to this very day in politics such as Christian nationalism. So it's not surprising that Christian nationalism continues to get the cross all wrong by insisting to interpret it in terms of ritual blood sacrifice as one of its chief doctrines. If you don't believe this, you're not Christian. In today's gospel reading, I believe Jesus is intentionally being cannibalistic in order to throw the wrongness of humanity's central religion before us. His Jewish audience no longer practiced cannibalism, but they needed to see that their way of life was descended from cannibalism and still horrific in its lust for human blood in order to maintain order. The Roman Empire and its Jewish collaborators would in fact consume Jesus on the cross and see its horrific display of violence, which looks so horrible to us. But, think of it in terms of us executing the bad guy, which we still do, right? As, a little bit of violence to maintain the order. So too must we come to see any positions like Christian nationalism and our own continued acceptance of violence as cannibalism. Updated forms of cannibalism, where instead of ingesting flesh and blood, we instead consume human flesh and blood by means of bullets from huge stockpiles of military rifles, and by means of fiery bombs from our cannons and missiles. We need to see these things as no less horrific than cannibalism. In order for us to be ready to begin to start looking for another way. American novelist Flannery O'Connor, whose life is portrayed in the recent movie Wildcat, once said of her own work, I use the grotesque in the way that I do because people are deaf and dumb, and I need to help them see and hear. This is what I think Jesus is doing in today's gospel, using the grotesqueness of cannibalism in order to get us to see and hear how horrific our continued faith in violence continues to be. And at the same time, he offers us an alternative. The cross will not be about Jesus being the victim of God's sacrificial demands. The cross will be about laying down his own life in order for us to see the horror of our human political violence for what it is. We must see this and hear it. That the cross is not about God's demands for continued violence. The cross is about God's love, sending the Son into the world to offer us the only true alternative to violence. The yeast of love, the yeast of a compassion that is even willing to let itself be consumed by our human violence in order to transform it into something else. The something else represented here by these elements, transformed by yeast, the bread and the wine. We gather not before an altar of blood sacrifice, but rather around this table of human fellowship, where we are united as one human family for the sake of the world. May we once again let these yeasty elements transform us into a new generation of humanity that represents seeking harmony, the kind of harmony we need to address all these challenges that face us. May we be transformed by the compassion of the one who let his body be broken by us, for us, who let his blood be poured out by us, for us. This is the bread of abundant life. This is the wine of salvation.